Feudalism is a structure of medieval societies, where the landowner lords controlled the political and economic relationships of society by giving protection to peasants' serfs and exploiting their labor. Serfdom is the status of peasants and lower-class people under feudalism, in which they were forced to work for lords' manor with little rights. The causes of the weakening of feudalism after the 15th century. Increasing demand for workforce. Increasing productive activities. Monarchy is a form of government, in which a single ruler holds all political power over the society. Monarchs change through a hereditary rule, mostly in a single family. Absolutist monarchy as the head of lords as a form of government gradually weakened in the West, as well as its ideology of absolute divine right of kings. Since division of power among various classes and liberating towns and markets strengthened power of commercial capitalists against those absolutist monarchs, more liberal ideas in terms of government spread further around Western Europe. But in Eastern Europe, absolutist power of monarchy, Tsars in Russia, was used to strengthen serfdom and privileges of aristocratic classes. French Revolution initiated the idea of nation in the West. Parliaments, political parties, trade unions emerged with the development of nation-states. Capitalism is a mode of production that depends on private property and accumulation of profit through market exchanges. Civil society generally refers to the sections of society and their political, economic activities, which are independent from government. Adoption of Western institutions in the East created foreign-educated new elite and military bureaucracies, who started to question their absolutist monarchies. Economic crisis that started peasant and worker demonstrations against the regime coupled with defeat of Russia in the Russian-Japanese War in 1905 pushed the regime to accept limited parliament and legal reforms for citizen rights. That period was called the First Revolution in Russian history in 1905. According to Lenin, Russian society, workers and peasants, can only be saved by overthrowing the centuries-old Russian Tsarism and capitalist property relations through a working-class-led revolution. He called this working-class party model Vanguard Party, a party that can lead workers in political struggle. The function of Vanguard Party is to develop political consciousness. Marxism frees working class by socializing the means of productions. The main purpose of Marxism is to end private property's power over social relationships. Socialism is an economic system that is characterized by social ownership of means of production and workers' self-management. The most important reasons for Soviets emerging as an alternative forms of power were first, soldiers predominantly protested the conditions in the war front. Second, peasants demanded more equal land distribution, and third, workers wanted more just working conditions and better pay. Automation of work and institution of hierarchy among workers fed the increasing authoritarianism and bureaucratization of Soviet political life. Inflation, low prices, poverty, and unemployment are widespread in capitalist market economies. In the Soviet Union, centrally planned economy targeted to reach self-sufficiency position within a shorter period of time. Soviet Union officials aimed to promote heavy industry as opposed to consumer goods because it was seen as a way to surpass the enormous requirements of capital accumulation. The reasons to criticize central planning economies: they are not flexible. They are costly. The system is inefficient. They are open to corruption. Soviet invasion of Hungary was a sign to its allies and the Western world that USSR will not tolerate a complete break from the Warsaw Pact security system. But at the end, these protest movements gave Polish and Hungarian governments more maneuvering field when negotiating with Soviets. For example, Polish Catholic Church increased its public presence after those protest movements, and later years independent trade union Solidarity led by Lech Wałęsa continued their activities in that tradition. These protest movements mainly questioned the feasibility of Soviet model in their domestic societies. Issues like collectivization of agriculture, power of secret police, productivity of Soviet factory management system, restrictions on art and culture, all were controversial topics that protesters raised in 1950s. Lech Wałęsa, Polish retired politician and labor activist. Founder of the trade union Solidarity in 1980s. Served as President of Poland between 1990 and 1995. The economic conclusion of perestroika is free price policy. Shock therapy is used in Russian economy to end the transition quickly. Shock therapy is sudden withdrawal of currency. The results of shock therapy which was applied in Russian economy. In terms of transition to a free market economy, Yeltsin and his main aide Gaidar applied what economists called shock therapy to the Russian economy in order to finish this transition period as soon as possible. This unrelentless trade liberalization in Russia entailed first, fast privatizations of more than half of state enterprises, which benefited former Communist Party bureaucrats and their new oligarch friends, as the value of these enterprises were not calculated on any feasibility report but mostly determined by the corrupt dealings of the new state elite and former managers of those industrial enterprises. Mafia economy and primitive accumulation of capital through illegal means were widespread in the early years of transition. Secondly, IMF program requires from Russia legalization of land ownership and ending inefficient agricultural subsidies of former Soviet regime. Also, what accompanied to those measures was the rapid removal of price controls and letting market demand and supply rules replace government controls on light consumer industries. To totally unprepared society that brought speculation, corruption, and rampaging inflation as most of the industrial and agricultural production of Russia decimated. The results of shock therapy which was applied in Russian economy. Growth numbers for the former Eastern Bloc countries during 90s were pretty negative. For example, Belarus lost 35%, Georgia 70%, Ukraine more than 60% of their previous industrial activity. Russian growth rates hovering around 2% in the collapsing days of the USSR. First declined to -6 to 7% in the first years of shock therapy and then stabilized around 1% just before the Russian debt crisis in 1998. Russia lost most of the knowledge-based capital-intensive production in the transition as brain drain to abroad, and the collapse of state structures greatly decreased skilled workforce and capital investment in high-technology areas. Increasing inflation numbers encouraged people to demand foreign currency as nobody has any confidence in local currencies. In some parts of Russia, bartering became a new way of sustaining life as unemployment and lack of consumer goods force people to exchange their belongings in new free markets. As an example of this collapse in living standards, Russian male life expectancy dropped from 64 years to 58 years in that decade. Fertility rates of the country declined around 35% within a decade. Most of the privatized industries did not bring intended industrial growth, since new oligarchs, who bought these factories a lot of times in illegal ways, did not bother to reinvest profits in country's infrastructure or potential areas but prefer to evade taxes and smuggling money to offshore financial centers. After Mao's death, the ruling party had factional fightings, and at last Deng Xiaoping became the leader of the ruling party, and in 1978 he signaled to implement a series of pro-market reforms. Ping argued that those measures of opening up the China to global economy will provide much-needed technology and industrial capital to the country. He did not think self-sufficient autarkic model of Mao would work in the future. Chinese market was open to foreign investment under strict supervision of the party after 1978. Peasants were let free to lease private land up to 30 years and given a chance to privately accumulate through production for markets. These measures inevitably brought more weight for the markets and their price signals in demand and supply conditions. Chinese state also gave permission for opening of private and collective enterprises in county and towns. The main aim of Chinese socialism was to protect the political independence of strategic sectors. The reasons why China is considered as a mixed economy. Private sector has strict guidelines from the state. They combine private interests with state plans. Since 2001, when China entered into WTO, World Trade Organization, most economists in the WTO classified Chinese enterprises as not different from private corporate entities in terms of decision-making autonomy. That means these state-owned corporations usually decide production and marketing according to the market price signals. In property laws, these state corporations are also accepted as equals to other private property owner individuals. Thus, China mainly accepted most of the basic rules of market capitalism since 2000s. Mikhail Gorbachev, 8th and the last General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, and the last leader of the USSR. In 1985, amidst all these problems surrounding Soviet society, Mikhail Gorbachev, 54-year-old Politburo member, was chosen as the General Secretary of the party. He saw the need for reform in the system and declared his program of Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost and Perestroika, Gorbachev's reform for political and economic liberalization and transparency in the 1980s USSR. In 1989, first in the Eastern Europe, Polish government recognized the Solidarity trade union as a formal opposition, and it paved the way for the formation of first non-communist government in Eastern Europe after Senate elections. But Solidarity movement and its longtime leader Wales's anti-party, anti-political stance somewhat weakened the active formation of political organizations in the new parliamentary republic. China has transformed itself from an isolated state into the manufacturing workshop of the world in the last 3 decades since the 1980s. At the beginning of 1980, China's total share of world production was 2.6%, while this decade that number rose to almost 9% of the total world output. So, one can predict the enormous transformation that China went through with the expanding globalization of production. But what made those changes in China? If we look at the features of the Chinese Revolution in 1949, it was different from Soviet experience in terms of the dominance of peasants over the culture and politics of the country. So China did not develop even early Soviet democracy. Maoists largely accused the USSR in the 1950s for collaborating with the world capitalist system.